stage. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you.
I will also introduce you.
Yes, please.
Tamara is a researcher, PhD candidate, and lecturer affiliated with the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. And she is currently working on a PhD thesis on the social consequences of the conflict in Maluku between 1999 and 2004.
Correct, thank you.
And you want to say something about you wearing a mask?
Yes, I'm very sorry if you cannot see my expression, but I'm not one of the fittest who might survive the pandemic, so it's necessary for me to keep this on. Thank you.
Okay. Tamara, when we talk about Moluccans, Maluku people, we talk about a very complicated position. We will elaborate on that, but I want to start with a question that I always have in mind, and maybe many Indonesians with me. Why did the Moluccans choose the Dutch side?
The question is whether we actually chose the Dutch side.
Okay.
I think it's a very complicated situation. We are after independence, and including during revolution, we are mostly associated with KNIL and those who fight for the Dutch side. But the question was always whether we actually made that decision to be Dutch soldier. Now, to put it into context, Maluku was colonized much longer than other parts of Indonesia, and colonization is not only about physical occupation of a particular place or land. It's also about changing of the whole system, including belief system. It's also about erasure of knowledges, of your beliefs, of your gods even. And it's about changing your whole self.
Okay, so
in a way.
So you what you want to say is maybe that there was not only physical colonization,
yes,
but also mental colonization.
I wouldn't say mental, I would use the word subjectivity. So when you are colonized and your land was taken, your whole livelihood was taken and changed, then at one point becoming a soldier is not an option. When the Dutch need soldiers, then they recruited from the Moluccans, from the area that also religiously they already converted. So these are people that are easier to be included in the Dutch military force. Now, at the same time, becoming soldiers is, in my understanding, the ultimate colonization. It's the ultimate defeat, the ultimate subjectification, because the essence of being a soldier is complete obedient. You don't question anything. So becoming a soldier for Maluccans, it's not a pleasant thing. It was also something that, it's not whether I want this water or something else. It's not necessarily an option. You ended up becoming a soldier.
Okay, earlier you also mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the fact that that the Dutch used religion as a means of colonization. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's part of the gold, gospel, and glory. And the missionaries were part of, you have military and you have the traders, but you also have missionaries. And it's part of, the assumptions that these people are not necessarily people first. They're not necessarily human or maybe subhuman. And one way for us to save them or to help them to become human or civilized is to introduce them to religion.
Okay, so you said that by religion the Dutch were trying to save the people or to form the people?
It's one of the way, right? So it's one of the way to humanize these creatures, let's say so. But at the same time, then later on, it also served the purpose of, creating obedient subject.
Okay, I have to let that sink in.
Sorry.
No problem. And as I said, the position of the Moluccans was and still is very complicated because in Indonesia they were seen as traitors. But when they came here in the Netherlands, the country didn't welcome them. So how do you see this?
Just like that, first of all, I think it's important that Malucans never actually moved. The Dutch came to Maluku and claimed the area, but also then subjectified the people. And then after the Indonesian independence, this area became parts of the new republic. The people never actually crossed the border, as one of the decolonial Gloria Ansaldúa speaks about the case in Latin America or in New Mexico that was annexed by United States. The border, we didn't cross the border, the border crossed us. And I can relate to this in the case of Maluku. You didn't become Dutch by choice. It's if you go to a certain place and reclaim that nationality. It was an identity that is forced upon you. Same with being Indonesian. Now, under the Dutch, as the colonies, as I mentioned before, we were not necessarily considered as full human beings, right? And then we are already turned into soldiers. And during the War of Independence, including, we were also, if you're under the Dutch forces, then you're fighting the Republican Pemuda and other people. Now, that's not necessarily a choice first. And then, under the Indonesian Republic, this area, along with its people, become part of Indonesia. But how can you be a traitor of something that did not exist before?
Yeah.
But still, that is the narrative that sticks. That is the identity that sticks, as if the identity of Malucans is only Dutch soldier.
Yeah.
Now, the part of not being necessarily accepted as fully human beings when included as soldiers was proven when Malucans arrived in the Netherlands, and you see that how they were treated.
Yeah.
So you're a tool for this war of power.
Okay, so like the Moluccans didn't or don't get the place in the narrative of Indonesia as well as narrative of the Dutch.
Yes, I think if you see the map of Indonesia, eastern part is at the margin. And I think the position of Maluku in Indonesia is still at the margin. And during colonial time, it's also margin. It exists in support or to benefit the center, but not necessarily the center. And probably will not be center.
Okay, we will elaborate on that later, but your work is about the impact of colonialism. So maybe can you first explain to me what's the difference between colonialism and coloniality and decolonism and decoloniality before we
yes,
go into the subject?
I think the term decolonization is rather popular these days. Now, when we speak about colonialism, we speak about a system, also an ideal, right? Now, when we speak about coloniality, it's the underlying logic of that system of oppression. That underlying logic includes segregation, separation, hierarchy, for example, and including practices like divide and conquer. Now, when we speak about decolonization, it's important to separate it into two. First is the decolonization as in the former or still colonizers leaving their former colonies in the 1940s onwards. That is decolonization period as well. But then when we speak about decolonization in terms of coloniality, then you have decoloniality. That's about the linking from that logic of colonization. Because coloniality or colonialism even does not necessarily stop when the colonizers left their colony physically. Because the system is there, the logic is still there, the practices remains, the violence remains.
Yeah, and according to you, the system is still there. The colonial system is still there in Maluku until now.
I think it's everywhere. No, I mean like the fact that we ended up with the same system. After colonization, the only option to exist is as a nation state, for example. So in a way, to link it with revolution, we change power, we change faces, but the system remains.
Yeah, and what do you think is missing in the decolonization or decoloniality discourse? Which one do I have to use? decoloniality or decolonization
Decolonization, perhaps.
decolonization discourse regarding the Moluccans?
I think this is a process that is unfinished. What was finished or considered completed is the fact that the area was, the former colonizer, in this case the Dutch, left the area physically. Whether they actually left completely, that's a big question mark, right? Because in global system as well, the West still is the center of power, and the former colonized area becomes the periphery to support the center. Now that process, okay, we can say that is completed, but the remnants of colonization, the impact of the hundreds of years of violence remains, and it is not solved until now. I think in many cases the impact, the War of Independence, the revolution that comes after the issue of RMS, Permesta, all these wars and even recent conflicts, one way or another you will find the link to the colonial violence.
Yeah. And in an earlier interview, you mentioned that the grand narratives of history, in this case the narrative of Indonesia and the narrative of the Netherlands, are problematic. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, grand narratives of, history. Now, history is always related with grand narratives, right? One truth, one narrative, because this narrative is also related, history is also related to nation-building process. Especially in the case of Indonesia, for example, this is a state that is formed by unification of area. Prior to European colonization, these are several states, several nations. Now you have to become one nation state. So you need something to bind that, and one of the things is that you and I learn the same history. And that is the history of Indonesia. Now Indonesia is a huge country. We didn't experience every period similarly. Now on the other side, you also have history from the perspective of the Netherlands, from the Dutch. And this serves to build nationalism within the Dutch people. So in that sense, nationalism will always, history will always connect it to nationalism, and in a way it's a kind of propaganda, basically. Yeah. Because to form this one story and become history, you have to erase many others that doesn't match the grand narratives that you want.
So now you want us to erase the grand narrative?
Well,
please say yes.
Well, in a way, perhaps to reduce history to just a story. I think, I'm not a historian, so I apologize in advance, but I believe in stories rather than history. And I think what I want to do, or what I'm trying to do also in my work, is to provide spaces for all these stories to coexist together, instead of just one truth and one story. Because if you only allow one truth and one story, people will kill each other for it to become the one telling their story.
Yeah, but yes, that deserves an applause, of course. But if you reject the grand narratives, like I went to school in Indonesia, and of course you and I shared the same pelajaran sejarah, history lessons. If you reject these stories, the grand narratives, do historical events still have meaning for you? Like, how do you see 17 August in Indonesia, or commemorations of war victims in the Netherlands? How do you place those things?
I think those historical events will still have meanings, but then it doesn't have the same meaning for everybody. Now, the party that would not be happy with rejection of those grand narratives are the states. Now, regular people perhaps would be happy if their stories or the stories of their grandfather, grandmothers would be told openly and accepted as part of, narratives of that period, instead of just one story that they cannot relate to. Now, I struggle with pelajaran sejarah because I cannot relate to that. But I do understand that for those historical events, I have family stories about that events. Now, then 17th of August would be given different meanings according to how you experience that. And then when we open the possibility for other meanings, perhaps the Indonesian nation state would not be very happy about that. Same with, I think, Remembrance Day here. It will become very different. And I don't think everybody would be very happy if we allow other stories, because I think one of the questions that was and always being asked here is, how do you commemorate something like that when at the same time you're doing the same thing in other places? So can you accept that? Will you accept that? Are you ready to accept that? Because this is one of the consequences of allowing other stories to come into play.
Yeah, then it will become, I think, more chaotic, just like the Revolution period at that time.
It would not. Well, all events are always chaotic, right? Life is not that clean cut. But to accept that, there are many versions. Not all of us are there experiencing the same thing, and for one event or for all kind of wars, we cannot just be either victims or perpetrators, but we can be both at the same time.
Yeah. I'm also interested when you said that you don't have any feelings about Indonesian history lessons, because I come from Java, of course, the center of the world, but did it have something to do with the position of the Maluku people, the Moluccans, in the history of Indonesia, but also in the history of the Netherlands?
Yes, and dry narratives is always about linearity, right? You have dates, events, people.
Yeah.
Now, I got bad grades on those kind of things because first, I'm really bad at memorizing dates, really bad at memorizing people, and really bad at memorizing events, especially when I cannot connect them to something tangible.
So you were a bad student?
I was. Still am, perhaps.
Okay.
So in a way, I cannot connect to those stories and memorizing these events, because these are, let's just say that I'm not very good at accepting propaganda. Maybe that's better.
And then you already knew that it was a propaganda when you were 7 or 6 or 8, because I just found out like...
Of course not.
10 years ago.
If you asked me 10, 20 years ago, I would stand with that propaganda because, I was raised a nationalist.
Yeah.
And at one point you learn, right, and you see these things and you realize, oh, that was a propaganda. That was something that you are forced to accept. It's part of a process of brainwashing in order to smoothen the process of nation building. And once you realize that, then you can see, at least I can see, oh, this is the reason why I cannot connect.
Yeah. Very beautifully said. Okay, I see that the audience is very